It was the summer of 2010 in Jackson, Mississippi, a humid, heavy heat settling over the city. The Harris family appeared to be living a perfectly normal life. David Harris, 42, had built a respectable career as a police officer patrolling the streets of Jackson for the past 2 decades. To the outside world, he was a figure of authority, calm under pressure, and admired for his dedication to his job. His wife Marie ran a small but thriving hair salon in town. Known for her cheerful personality and hard-working nature, she had built strong relationships with her clients and was proud of the business she had created from the ground up. Together they lived in a modest, well-kept home in a quiet suburb of Jackson, where everything seemed steady and predictable. Marie's daughter Rachel was 20 years old and focused on her nursing studies at a local university. Rachel was intelligent, driven, and full of ambition. She wanted to make a life for herself outside of Jackson one day, using her nursing degree to help others and perhaps move to a larger city. She lived at home to save money, balancing her studies with a part-time job at a local clinic. Despite her busy schedule, she and Marie had a close relationship, leaning on each other after the difficulties of Marie's previous divorce. Rachel had always respected David for his work as a police officer, but their relationship remained distant. He was the man her mother had married 3 years ago, but Rachel never felt entirely comfortable with him. David had always kept a professional distance from Rachel. He was firm with an air of control that seemed fitting for someone in law enforcement. He wasn't particularly warm, but he wasn't hostile either, just someone who maintained a certain boundary. He played the role of stepfather dutifully, but never tried to intrude too much into Rachel's life. This dynamic worked for Rachel. She focused on school and her life outside the home, grateful for the stability David brought to her mother's life. Marie, too, seemed content with her family's routine. She spent long hours at her salon, often leaving David and Rachel alone in the house. As the summer months stretched on, however, things began to shift. David, who had once kept his distance, started paying more attention to Rachel. It started innocently enough. He would offer her rides to school or the clinic where she worked. He'd ask her how her day was or make small talk about her studies. At first, Rachel didn't think much of it. After all, it was normal for family members to be concerned about one another, wasn't it? But as time passed, the nature of David's attention began to change. His compliments, once innocuous, became more personal. He would comment on her appearance in ways that made her uncomfortable, complimenting her on how she looked when she returned from work, or how a certain dress suited her. There was a lingering quality to his words that Rachel couldn't quite place, something beneath the surface that made her uneasy. David also began finding reasons to be around her more often. When Marie worked late at the salon, he would offer to make dinner for both of them. He'd suggest watching a movie together in the living room, something he had never done before. Rachel, now noticing the subtle shifts in their interactions, began to feel increasingly uncomfortable, though she struggled to identify why. She reasoned that she was being paranoid. After all, David was just trying to be more involved, wasn't he? But the unease remained creeping slowly into her daily life. There were moments that seemed too deliberate to be coincidence. David would ask personal questions about her relationships, her friends, her future plans. They were the kinds of questions that a parent might ask, but the way David asked them felt too probing, too intimate. He was trying to get closer to her, and Rachel could feel it. She didn't know how to react. She had always respected him as her stepfather, but the dynamic between them was changing, and it frightened her. Rachel tried to push the feelings away, focusing on her nursing program and spending as much time outside of the house as possible. She picked up extra shifts at the clinic, studied late into the night, and met up with friends to avoid being along with David. But no matter how hard she tried to avoid him, she couldn't escape the tension building within the household. It was subtle, creeping into their daily lives without warning. Rachel felt the shift in every interaction, in the way David's eyes lingered on her longer than they should, in the way his voice softened when they were alone. Marie remained blissfully unaware of the growing tension between her husband and daughter. To her, everything seemed perfectly normal. She was busy with her salon, managing clients and schedules, often leaving early in the morning and coming home late in the evening. She was grateful that David had stepped in to take care of things at home when she couldn't. She didn't notice the way Rachel had started to pull away, the quiet unease that now defined her daughter's interactions with David. David, for his part, was careful. He never acted out in ways that were overt or could easily be questioned. He maintained his image as the strong, protective stepfather. To those around him, he was the same David, calm, collected, and in control. But behind closed doors, the dynamic was changing, and David was in control of that too. He saw Rachel's hesitation, her confusion, and he used it to his advantage. He offered her more rides, more excuses to be alone with him, all while maintaining the facade of a caring stepfather. As the summer days gave way to autumn, Rachel's unease turned to dread. She could no longer deny that something was wrong. The one stable household now felt like a trap, and Rachel felt herself slipping further into a situation she couldn't fully comprehend. The tension simmered beneath the surface, growing stronger with each passing day. Something was building, something neither Rachel nor David could fully control, and it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. The illusion of stability was beginning to crack, and the Harris family's perfect facade would soon shatter beyond repair. By the time the crisp air of autumn settled over Jackson, Mississippi in 2010, the unease Rachel had been feeling for months had intensified into something she could no longer ignore. The once cordial but distant relationship between her and her stepfather, David, had shifted into something far more uncomfortable. Despite her attempts to avoid him, it was nearly impossible. Her mother, Marie, was working long hours at the salon, leaving Rachel and David alone together more often than not. Rachel had noticed the small changes in David's behavior over the summer, but she had convinced herself that she was imagining things. After all, David was a well-respected police officer, a man of discipline and structure. Surely whatever strange feelings she had were just in her head, but the subtle shifts in his interactions with her, the way his compliments seemed to carry a weight that they hadn't before. The lingering glances, the way he found excuses to spend time with her, made it increasingly hard to deny. One particular evening in late October, things took a darker turn. It was a quiet Tuesday, and Marie had called from the salon to say she'd be late again, swamped with last-minute clients. Rachel had planned to spend the night studying, but David insisted they watch a movie together. She felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach, but didn't see a way to politely refuse. She settled on the far end of the couch, keeping her distance, hoping to get through the evening without incident. As the movie played, Rachel tried to focus on the screen, but she could feel David's eyes on her. Every time she glanced over, he quickly averted his gaze, pretending to be engrossed in the film. The tension in the room was palpable, and Rachel's discomfort grew with each passing minute. Halfway through the movie, David shifted closer, closing the space between them. Rachel tensed but didn't move, her body frozen in a mix of fear and uncertainty, and then it happened. David reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from Rachel's face. His fingers lingered on her cheek longer than necessary. The gesture, which could have been innocent in another context, was anything but. Rachel felt her heart race as a wave of panic washed over her. The touch was too intimate, too deliberate. She pulled away instinctively, her body recoiling as her mind struggled to process what had just happened. For a moment, the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Rachel's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Did he mean to do that? Was it just a misunderstanding? But deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't the first time David had crossed a line, but it was the most blatant. David, however, acted as though nothing was wrong. He casually returned his attention to the television, his face a mask of indifference. The ease with which he dismissed the moment left Rachel feeling more confused and vulnerable than ever. She didn't know what to do or how to react. She had never been in a situation like this before, and the power dynamics between them made everything more complicated. As the evening dragged on, Rachel excused herself and retreated to her bedroom. Locking the door behind her, she leaned against the door, her body trembling as the reality of the situation settled in. She felt trapped by the silence, by her fear of what speaking out might do to her family. Her mother had finally found stability with David, and Rachel couldn't bear the thought of destroying that. But how could she continue living in the same house, pretending that everything was fine when it was clear that things had changed irrevocably over the next few days? Rachel did everything she could to avoid being alone with David. She left the house early for school, stayed late on campus, and made excuses to avoid dinner at home. But no matter how hard she tried to distance herself, David seemed to find ways to insert himself into her life. He would send her texts, checking in on her under the guise of concern, offering to help her with her studies or pick her up from class. His messages were always polite, but Rachel could sense the underlying manipulation. He was testing her, seeing how far he could push without crossing an overt boundary. Rachel's mental state began to deteriorate. She became withdrawn, her usual bubbly demeanor replaced by a quiet, subdued version of herself. Her friends noticed the change, asking if everything was okay, but Rachel didn't know how to explain what was happening. How could she tell anyone that her stepfather, a man respected in the community, was making her feel unsafe in her own home? David, sensing Rachel's growing internal conflict, used his position of authority to further manipulate her. He would remind her of his connections in the police department, casually mentioning how he could help her if she ever got into trouble. He painted himself as her protector, someone she could rely on, even as he subtly tightened his grip on her life. It was a calculated form of control, one that left Rachel feeling increasingly powerless. She began to feel the walls closing in. Each day, the weight of the secret grew heavier, pressing down on her chest until it was difficult to breathe. She knew that if she confronted David, or worse, told her mother, the consequences would be devastating. The fragile stability of their family would shatter, and Rachel couldn't bear the thought of putting her mother through their pain. And so Rachel stayed silent, trapped in a web of manipulation and fear. David continued to blur the lines between stepfather and something far more insidious, while Rachel struggled to maintain a semblance of normalcy in a world that was slowly spiraling out of control. The boundary between them had been crossed, and there was no going back. The question now was how far David would go, and whether Rachel would find the strength to stop him before it was too late. As autumn deepened, the tension in the Harris household became unbearable. Rachel felt as though she was walking on a tightrope, each step more precarious than the last. And with every passing day, the line between her fear, though she was walking on a tightrope, each step more precarious than the last. And with every passing day, the line between her fear and David's control grew thinner, threatening to snap at any moment. As the weeks turned into months, the psychological manipulation David exerted over Rachel deepened. It was now late December 2010 in Jackson, Mississippi, and the oppressive tension inside the Harris household grew with each passing day. What had once been a simple family dynamic, a stepfather, a mother, and a daughter, had evolved into something dark and complex. Rachel, only 20 years old, found herself entangled in a web of emotional abuse and control that she couldn't fully comprehend or escape. David, 42, and a seasoned police officer, used his authority and calculated charm to isolate Rachel from the world. His manipulation wasn't sudden or aggressive, but gradual and insidious. He made her believe that they shared something unique, something beyond the comprehension of others, especially her mother. He convinced her that the lines between right and wrong, between love and betrayal, were blurred when it came to their relationship. Rachel was too confused and emotionally trapped to see the situation for what it truly was: abuse masked as affection. At first, David's advances had been subtle, compliments that became more personal, touches that lingered a moment too long. But as the weeks went on, those boundaries were crossed again and again. Rachel found herself falling deeper into a secret affair that both repulsed and entranced her. She felt conflicted, torn between the guilt that gnawed at her conscience and the psychological grip David had on her. The affair itself was shrouded in secrecy, taking place mostly in the house while Marie was working late at her salon. David would often orchestrate situations where he and Rachel were alone. Whether it was under the guise of watching television together, discussing her college life, or simply being in the same room, he would slowly escalate the intimacy between them. Rachel, at first resistant, found herself slowly escalate the intimacy between them. Rachel, at first resistant, found herself slowly losing the will to fight back. David had convinced her that their connection was inevitable, that resisting it was futile. David's justifications for their relationship were complex and manipulative. He told Rachel that they were kindred spirits, that what they had was something rare and precious, something no one else could understand. He played on her emotions, preying on her vulnerability and naivety. He positioned himself as someone who could protect her, someone who understood her better than anyone else. Over time, Rachel began to internalize this narrative, even though a part of her knew it was wrong. Rachel's guilt weighed heavily on her. She felt trapped by the situation, unable to confide in anyone, not even her closest friends. She feared that if the truth came out, it would destroy her family, especially her mother. The weight of this secret caused Rachel to withdraw from her social life. She stopped attending college events, and her grades began to slip. Her professors noticed the decline in her academic performance, but Rachel, consumed by the emotional turmoil at home, couldn't bring herself to seek help. Marie, oblivious to the turmoil within her own home, remained focused on her work. She trusted David implicitly, believing him to be a steady presence in their lives. To her, David was a strong, dependable man who had taken on the role of stepfather without hesitation. Murray had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. She noticed that Rachel seemed more withdrawn lately, but she assumed it was just the stress of college life. She believed that Rachel, like many young adults, was simply adjusting to the pressures of balancing studies and personal life. Meanwhile, David's control over Rachel grew. He began to monitor her movements more closely. He insisted on driving her to and from college under the pretense of protecting her, but Rachel knew it was another way for him to keep her close. He questioned her about her friends, her interactions with classmates, and her professors. He framed these inquiries as concern, but Rachel knew they were rooted in jealousy and possessiveness. David's manipulation extended beyond just their physical relationship. He used his position as a police officer to instill fear in Rachel. He would casually remind her of his connections within the community, his influence over the law, and how difficult it would be for her to expose their secret if she ever wanted to. Rachel, already emotionally fragile, began to feel as though there was no escape from David's grip. He had effectively cut her off from any source of support, isolating her emotionally and psychologically. As the holiday season approached, the tension in the house became unbearable. Rachel's once vibrant personality had dimmed, and she became a shadow of her former self. She avoided eye contact with her mother, feeling the weight of betrayal every time she looked at Marie. The guilt was consuming her, but she didn't know how to break free. Every time she considered telling someone, David's warnings echoed in her mind. The affair had transformed into a toxic and dangerous dynamic. Rachel was caught in a psychological prison, built by David's manipulations and her own internal conflict. She knew what they were doing was wrong, but she felt powerless to stop it. David had eroded her sense of self-worth, making her believe that no one would understand or believe her if she tried to expose the truth. In this toxic environment, Rachel's emotional isolation deepened. She no longer felt like herself. She withdrew from her studies, her friends, and her life outside the house. The once ambitious nursing student now felt like a prisoner in her own home, trapped by a secret that was tearing her apart. Each day brought new levels of control and manipulation from David, and Rachel felt as though she was losing her grip on reality. As the year drew to a close, the cracks in their fragile facade grew wider. The dangerous affair had poisoned not only Rachel's relationship with her mother, but also her sense of self. She knew the situation couldn't continue, but she didn't know how to stop it. The control David held over her was suffocating, and Rachel was left feeling completely alone. The affair, built on lies and manipulation, had reached a point of no return. Rachel's world was collapsing around her, and the consequences of their actions were about to catch up with them. The dangerous dynamic between David and Rachel had set the stage for a devastating unraveling, one that would change all of their lives forever. By late 2010, the Harris family's delicate balance was crumbling. Rachel was consumed by guilt and fear, her once vibrant personality replaced by anxiety as the secret affair with David weighed heavily on her. Despite her attempts to distance herself, David's possessiveness only grew. He became controlling, showing up at her college and questioning her every move. Rachel felt suffocated, while David's behavior became increasingly aggressive and manipulative. Marie, preoccupied with running her salon, initially missed the warning signs. Rachel's withdrawal and mood swings seemed like typical stress from school, but Marie started noticing something was wrong. The tension between David and Rachel was undeniable. One evening, Marie overheard a disturbing conversation between the two, fueling her suspicions. Determined to find out the truth, Marie began paying closer attention. She noticed the fearful way Rachel reacted around David and the strange dynamic between them. The growing tension pushed Marie to investigate further, leading her to a shocking discovery: a crumpled, intimate note from David to Rachel, hidden among her daughter's belongings. The note confirmed Marie's worst fears. David had been involved with Rachel. Devastated, Marie immediately confronted Rachel, who confessed everything in a tearful admission. The affair had been going on for months right under her nose. Betrayed and heartbroken, Marie lashed out at Rachel, calling her a traitor before storming out, leaving Rachel alone in guilt and shame. Later that night, David returned home, unaware of the confrontation. He found Marie packing her things, her face tear-streaked and filled with rage. When he demanded to know what was happening, Marie revealed she had found the note and knew about the affair. The argument that followed was explosive. Marie accused David of destroying their family, while David, defensive and angry, tried to deflect the blame. As the shouting escalated, Rachel returned home, walking straight into the confrontation. The tension was unbearable as David, cornered, began to unravel. His usual calm demeanor cracked, revealing desperation. In a moment of uncontrollable rage, David grabbed his police-issued gun and aimed it at Marie. Despite her pleas, David, overcome by fury, pulled the trigger, killing her instantly. The house fell into silence as Rachel stood in shock, watching her mother collapse. David, realizing the gravity of his actions, dropped the gun, horrified by what he had done. The once perfect facade of their family had been shattered, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. In the aftermath of the murder, the Harris household became a crime scene. Rachel, paralyzed by shock, could only stare at her mother's lifeless body on the floor. Blood pooling beneath her, the smell of gunpowder still lingering in the air. The silence in the house felt deafening after the gunshot had ripped through the air just moments ago. With trembling hands, Rachel reached for her phone, dialing 911, as her mind raced, unable to fully comprehend the horror of what had just happened. Her voice cracked as she tried to explain to the operator, the weight of the situation pressing down on her with every word. Within minutes, the police arrived, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow on the suburban street. The quiet neighborhood, which had always been a sanctuary of normalcy, was now a scene of chaos. Uniformed officers swarmed the house, and paramedics rushed inside, though it was already too late to save Marie. Rachel, still in shock, was led outside by an officer, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she sat on the front steps. staring blankly into the distance. Inside, the officer secured the scene. They found David's police-issued gun lying on the floor beside Marie's body. There was no sign of David. He had fled immediately after pulling the trigger, leaving Rachel alone to deal with the carnage he had created. The house, once filled with family photos and memories, now stood as a testament to the violence that had erupted within its walls. Rachel was taken to the police station for questioning. Her mind was a blur as detectives asked her to recount the events leading up to the shooting. She struggled to speak, her voice hollow, recounting the affair, the confrontation, and the moment her father had snapped. The guilt that had been festering inside her for months now consumed her entirely. She could hardly bear to look at the detectives as she told them the truth that had destroyed her family. She felt as though she had played a part in Marie's death, even though she knew deep down that David was the one who had pulled the trigger. Meanwhile, a manhunt for David began. His disappearance only intensified the media coverage, and the town of Jackson was gripped by the story of the once respected police officer who had killed his wife in a fit of rage. David's colleagues, the same officers who had once respected him, now led the search, their shock at his actions still fresh. He had vanished into the night. But with his law enforcement background, there was a fear that he might try to elude capture for good. 3 days later, a tip led the police to an abandoned cabin on the outskirts of Jackson, deep in the woods. The cabin had been used occasionally by hunters, but was now David's temporary hideout. When the officers surrounded the cabin, David made no attempt to flee. He was found sitting on the floor, disheveled and hollowed. The weight of his crime etched across his face. His hands were trembling as the officers coughed him, and for the first time since the murder, David muttered something unintelligible, a brief broken apology that hung in the air. He offered no resistance as he was led away, the reality of his downfall setting in. The trial that followed was swift and merciless. David, once an emblem of authority and respect in the community, was now the disgraced former officer charged with the murder of his wife and the manipulation of his stepdaughter. The courtroom was packed every day, with members of the community watching as David's life unraveled in public. Rachel, her face pale and drawn, sat quietly throughout the trial, her mother's memory weighing heavily on her. The prosecution laid out the case in brutal detail, the affair, the manipulation, and the murder. David's defense team offered little in return. There was no defense for what he had done, no justification that could absolve him of his crime. In the end, David was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence came down like a hammer, sealing his fate forever. As he was led out of the courtroom, he briefly glanced at Rachel, but there was no recognition in his eyes. He was a broken man, consumed by the consequences of his own actions. For Rachel, the trial marked the beginning of a long and painful journey toward healing. She was deeply traumatized, haunted by the events that had torn her family apart, the guilt of her involvement, the weight of her mother's death, and the abuse she had endured left her emotionally shattered. In the weeks following the trial, she sought therapy, desperate to make sense of the chaos that had consumed her life. The sessions were difficult, but they helped her begin to process the manipulation and control that David had exerted over her for so long. She slowly started to understand that she had been a victim, not the cause of her mother's death. In Jackson, the story of the Harris family became a cautionary tale, a tragic example of how secrets and lies could destroy even the most seemingly stable families. Marie Salon, once a vibrant part of the community, stood as a grim reminder of the life that had been taken too soon. The women who had once visited for haircuts and conversation now whispered about the tragedy, their voices tinged with pity and disbelief. Rachel, unable to face the weight of the town's judgment, made the difficult decision to leave Jackson. She moved to a nearby city far enough to escape the constant reminders, but close enough to stay connected to what little support she had left. Starting over wasn't easy. The trauma followed her everywhere she went, and the memories of that night haunted her dreams. But slowly, day by day, she began to rebuild her life. Though the town would never forget the tragic fall of the Harris family, Rachel was determined not to let it define her. The road to healing was long, but it was the only way forward. As the years passed, Rachel carried the weight of her past with her, but she also carried the strength she had found in surviving it. The life she rebuilt would be different, but it would be hers, a life no longer controlled by the ghosts of the past. Thank you for being with me until the end of this video. If you like true crime videos, be sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the videos I post every day. Thanks to all of you dear ones.